Is that Hendrix t-shirt? Oh, is that it? Yeah. Hey. He died 2 days ago. Our anniversary of it. It was the 18th of this month. It's the anniversary of his death. So I was just thinking about him recently, so it's a coincidence visually. Hello. How are you?
Good. Yes.
Just another day, right?
Yep.
We're running around all morning. My car's in the shop. I had to borrow a car to get here. It's been a lot of fun. So let's see where we are. Oh yeah, there's that and that. Okay, so I want to talk about the creation of the Virginia colony today and some of the developments of what will become structural and institutional racism, which will then lead to cultural racism. So we'll see how that relates to the rise of enslavement in the Atlantic system, where the idea initially comes from and how that builds. So just kind of a trigger warning, I have to talk about a couple of terrible things today. Some of this will be kind of shitty, all right? And I will make some points about just how shitty some people still are on this subject. So cool. I'm also going to give over the last, like, I don't know, 10 some minutes or whatever to somebody else talking. I'm going to play a little video clip of something to try and challenge you with an issue, kind of like, hit some of the same themes, but a little bit differently, right? So you get a different voice for a day and still tackle this subject, right? Because I think it's an important one for people to understand, especially since you guys have noticed that there's a lot of like manufactured controversy over the questions of racism, right? Like, oh my God, they're teaching critical race theory. You guys heard of CRT, right? Are you law students? Some of you maybe someday, but not today, right? Okay, cool. So you're not actually learning that because it doesn't make any sense, right? It's a legal framework for studying how laws built in the past have long-term effects and are structurally racist, right? Make sense? What people are objecting to is us talking about the history of racism in this country, right? And one of the things that sort of chaps my hide about this is that so many people get offended thinking that criticizing a situation that exists today and is based upon the past means that you somehow need to, like, I don't know, apologize for the past or go back and fix things, because no one's expecting us to do that. Like, literally no one has asked you to say, I'm sorry for racism, let's go back and fix things. It's done, it happened. What are the effects? That's what people leave out of this. There are significant long-term effects to centuries of enslavement, the development of racist ideologies to support that, and then there's a shit ton of laws in the last 150 years passed that reinforce a lot of those racial hierarchies. So if we don't understand the relationship between the structures, i.e. the laws, and how people actually learn and grow and behave in a society, since we grow up learning lessons from each other, then we're never going to fix this stuff. Make sense? So it's my quick little rant to start with. I'm actually going to walk you through a handful of laws from 17th century Virginia showing how early changes in the legal system were intended to force people to think about Africans differently, right? And that has some serious long-term consequences. Cool. So there's a little introduction, blah, blah, blah. Hey, look, it's tobacco jokes, right? Because tobacco will be important today. Y'all know this stuff kills you, right? Okay, cool, right? So totally fine if you want to do it, it's great, but it'll kill you. So it's just a thing. So there's that. I love how they denied that for so long. There's just a shit ton of evidence. I mean, how many people like just are coughing out their blood and they're getting lung cancer in their 50s? Like, no, smoking totally didn't cause this problem, right? And the doctors are like, here, and more doctors recommend Camels and they advertise. Like, what? This is one of the interesting problems with the corporation as a legal structure too, because since it's designed to insulate both its managers and its owners from liability, and the laws treat it like a person, they get away with saying all kinds of crazy shit that we'd get in trouble for, right? So something to watch out for. So here's our stuff to watch for today, blah, 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 blah. We're going back and addressing a few basic issues in the Atlantic system, how it works, connecting that into the Virginia colony, and going on from there. So first off, just to remind you what this basic term means. It is how we refer to the slave trade in the Atlantic Ocean. There are other slave trades. There are lots of them. There's a trans-Saharan slave trade. There's one in the Indian Ocean. There's a whole bunch of these things. The Atlantic system is the largest, the most profitable, and the most brutal of the various slave systems that we've known in history so far, which is why it gets a bit of special attention. This is not to say there have not been other kinds of slavery, but it is to say this one kind of matters. Right? Now, the question here is, once all the Amerindies are dying off, this is something that Spanish and Portuguese are discovering very, very quickly because, coughing on people somehow killed them, right? What do we do now? Like, how do we, I don't know, exploit all this cool land that we found if we don't have people that'll work it for us? So why don't we just bring people over and dump them here to work it for us, right? So there's the idea. The vast majority of slaves transported across the Atlantic are going to be placed in the Caribbean or in Brazil. But smaller numbers of them end up all over the place. So there's smaller numbers of Africans transported into what becomes Mexico, what becomes the United States, et cetera, et cetera. But the majority of them end up in the Caribbean and Brazil working on those plantations. What was that? Oh, yeah. Geez. Yeah, that's cut off somehow. Oops. Why that happens sometimes? Yep, that should be gold. Gold. Okay, the key here is that they find, again, the profitability of sugar. This is something I pointed out earlier on in this in the course here when we first went the Portuguese experimenting with it. Sugar grows quite well in the Caribbean and in Brazil, so you have a large need for labor, and it's very dangerous work, right? So people are going to be working in hot tropical suns, exposed to tons of diseases here, doing very, very dangerous work. So they have a relatively short lifespan, right? Which means you need a large, semi-expendable labor pool. No one really wanted to do that, hence slavery.
Because if there were for profit for the sugar and exchange slave, wouldn't it be more expensive to constantly buy slaves compared to
Certainly not. And this is one of the things we have to keep in mind in terms of just business decisions in general. This is an interesting question. You see all the time people making arguments that well, gosh, a company doesn't want to put something toxic in the food that will kill people because then their customers will die and how will they sell more food, right? But that's not really how it works. If you can put in small amounts of that stuff and get away with it, and the poisoning takes a very, very long time to take effect, and people continue to buy the product because they're sort of insulated from liability, yes, indeed, they will do it. We have a lot of really fun lawsuits all across the last century. Really great stuff like major airline manufacturers knowing that there's a defect in the plane that can cause them to crash and kill all the people on board. But it's not likely to happen very often. So they make an actuarial calculation. What will it cost us in terms of the lawsuits when people die and a plane crashes versus what will it cost us to fix all of the existing aircraft in the manufacturing process? If the latter is more expensive, they will kill you, right? And that's today, right now. Those decisions are made, in corporations all across this country, right? So all we have to do here is figure out how long will someone live, how much sugar will they produce in that amount of time, how much money does that produce for them, and how much did they cost in the first place? If they produce more sugar than it costs, them if they can basically pay for themselves first, then it doesn't matter. Then it's still cheaper to get somebody else than it is to slow down the process and do it in a less dangerous way. It's all about extracting as much value as you can, as quickly as you can, right? And that's kind of the driving force here in contemporary capitalism, right? It's trying to accumulate more value for shareholders as fast as possible. And again, this slave trade is going to get worse precisely when joint stock companies get involved. Particularly Dutch and then later English companies are going to organize themselves, and they're going to make this far more brutal than it initially was in the Portuguese, and that was bad enough, right? Because they're able to make those business calculations, figure out how much they're going to get out of it, and simply treat the people as cargo. So sadly, I wish that was the case. I really do, because it just seems like it seems like it should be, it seems like our lives should be worth more, but at the end of the day, it's just a business calculation. So Because we moved across here, most of the area we're talking about here is a strip down from where like Senegal and the Gambia are, all the way down to where Angola is, just north of Namibia, is where most of the slaves pulled into the Atlantic system come from, right? Slaves pulled into the Indian Ocean slave trading system or into the Ottoman Empire, usually coming from East Africa or North Africa or somewhere else here. But this strip along the coast is mostly where Europeans pulled people out for the Atlantic system. Why a lot of Americans of African origin have can trace their DNA into this specific area here. There's large numbers of people pulled out of these areas. This is not to say that there's not a lot of cultures in that area. It's one of the funny things about people saying, oh yeah, like African ancestry. Like, okay, well, where? Like, what does that mean? And even the countries are really deceptive because they were drawn by colonizers and they completely ignored a lot of the human geography. So which culture is it? Is the Fang, the Wolof, the Igbo? Like there's tons of different cultures and languages in here, right? And all of that just gets erased, right? Small bits of that are going to become parts of the Creole, the sort of like pidgin communities there, people blending certain ideas in. There are certain religious traditions in the Caribbean and in South America that blended elements from different places, blended elements of like Islam, Christianity, indigenous African faiths, kind of squished things together and made something new out of it. But all those, they come together from tons of people thrown together and they're just sharing bits of ideas. And they're always like kind of combines with whatever comes from the colonizer. But sort of interesting, fun point here, they did bring a lot of stuff with them that wasn't managed to be, completely destroyed. Tons of like, interesting techniques or cultural elements. Okay, here's a fun one. You guys know some of these colonies down here are going to start getting profitable later once they start figuring out how to like grow rice and things, growing other kinds of crops. But they couldn't actually figure out how to do it. It was the slaves that taught the European settlers how to plant rice in that environment, right? Because they recognized similarities. This is a bit like home, cool. I got it. I got this. And they figured out how to do it. And boom, it suddenly creates a profitable industry. Of course, driven on the back to slavery. But there's interesting technical innovations that come along with that. There's also, you guys know, like most of our musical traditions, right, come about from like, blending tons of elements of like West African music, West African rhythms that ultimately help give rise to like rhythm and blues, blues, eventually, jazz, rock, all kinds of stuff there, right? White people music was pretty boring, right? So it ends up being kind of like adopted, shifted, heads in different directions, but it's a nice like, shot in the arm for terrible European music at the time. Anyway, so tons of things do survive, but a lot is destroyed. There's a significant amount of cultural genocide that happens in the process of dragging people over here. And when you factor in the number of people who were intentionally killed in the process of it, we should understand this in somewhat genocidal terms still too.
You mentioned earlier that the American Indians died because of diseases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how about for the slaves that were brought in also, did majority of them die too?
No, actually, some people died just because of different climates they were put in. But because a lot of the population being pulled from sub-Saharan Africa were already from tropical climates, they already had some acclimation to living closer to the equator. So people tended to do a bit better. Europeans did much worse. So when we get to like, I'm talking about the Virginia colony later here, when we get into the whole Chesapeake Bay area, Europeans moving to that area dropped like flies because they were not well adapted to it. The Africans tended to do much better at it climate-wise. And disease-wise, the entire Eastern Hemisphere had always been in contact with each other. There'd always been trade links, and diseases will move wherever people or goods will move. So they were exposed to already all the same kind of germs. It's just that there was a giant ocean in between, so people in the Americas had never been exposed to the common cold. But people in sub-Saharan Africa or people in East Asia were still coughing up the same cold already because trade links over thousands of years had connected them. The Dutch I'm pointing out here do really improve the business processes here to make it more profitable. But in the process, of course, make it much more brutal. And this is where we start to see significant turns in the way people think about the slave trade and why ultimately the production of racist discourses are necessary. Because people have always enslaved each other, early slaves being picked up, bought from other Africans, and then taken into Europe or European territories. People often didn't really get the whole idea. They would work them for a while, and then after 10 years, let them go free anyway. They weren't thinking of them as like subhuman. They were thinking of them the way that people used to think about slaves. It's just a misfortune that falls upon some people, but it doesn't mean there's something biologically different about you, right? when the number of slaves wants to shoot way, way the hell up and it gets far more brutal, you have to come up with ways to justify what you're doing, to explain it to yourself so you can sleep at night. So the Dutch and English, and then everybody else starts getting into this, start developing all kinds of like ways to sort of dehumanize people. And on the flip side of this, I'm going to acknowledge at least that the brutality of it, the sheer horror of what a lot of British mariners were doing and British corporations were doing the slave trade is the reason that an abolition movement started much earlier in the UK and eventually helped to abolish the slave trade much earlier in the UK, because there was a lot of like discussion of it. You know, it was spreading around in newspapers and coffee houses. People were talking about this stuff because what they were doing was so bad and people were noticing. Right? So the larger scale of it, combined with like some of the technological differences, you guys know it's hard to hide today. We can like take pictures and upload them somewhere. So, you know, it's sort of like an earlier version of that, where stories are, you know, and accounts from slaves and former slaves were appearing in newspapers, and, you know, former slaves were coming around and talking to people and explaining the horrors of it. But they first had to make it much worse before they got involved to try and like stop it. So thinking about how this works, you are going to pack as many people as you can into a ship. Now, you guys know how ships work in this time, right? They're wooden ships, right? So they're rocking around a lot, like this, right? They're slow because they're driven by sail power, right? And you're crossing the Atlantic pretty close to the equator and Middle Passage, where it's hot as hell, right? It's warm near the equator. And you're going to pack as many people into a cargo hold as you can, and then cross the ocean near the equator. So people are baking inside and they're getting seasick and throwing up all over each other. Obviously, they don't have like, I don't know, toilet facilities. So people are shitting all over each other and pissing all over each other and then puking again all over each other because of the smell. And then maybe if you're lucky, once a day, a little bit of time, they'll take people up onto the deck in chains, you know, maybe let them scrub a little bit of themselves off, right? And then go back down. And it just carries on day after day after day. And inevitably, since you're chained down on the ground there, someone next to you is going to die. And then you're stuck chained to a dead person until one of the sailors notices. And then they'll just undo that person, throw them overboard. And that's that. You with me so far? Right, can you at least viscerally imagine what it's like to be packed in like this, packed in like the proverbial sardines, and then carried across the ocean slowly in a rocking wooden sailing ship near the equator where it's fucking hot, right? So doing this day after day is what desensitized a lot of these slavers and the slave traders and the ships to what they were doing, right? They had to start thinking about the people as not people. They had to start thinking them as like cattle or some other product, right? Because if you look people in the eyes and you recognize their humanity, it's really hard to do things like this. People always need to tell stories themselves. You see this in tons of places. I'll hit similar points when we talk about some really shitty episodes like the Holocaust later in this class, right? The people who have to participate in things like this have to tell themselves things to make it possible to do, right? Because most people are just not capable of that kind of brutality on their own, right? Cool so far? So you guys have probably seen diagrams like this at some point.
How long was the trip?
I mean, you're at best crossing in the most possibly favorable conditions from the shortest possible route, a few weeks. Most trips across took 2 or 3 months, right? So a couple of months in a rocking wooden ship near the equator, and you're packed in there tightly, right? This is not going to be a comfortable trip. And a lot of people are going to die. And what they ended up doing was, you know, the decks inside wooden sailing ships are not very high, right? People used to be a little shorter too. So, you know, I've been inside some reconstructions of older ships here, and you got a duck in a lot of these things anyway, just to move around, or at least I do, right? They're not very big decks, right? And what they did was they built a platform to split the deck in half. So people are squished into a space about this high. So you cannot even sit up, much less stand. And so you're laying down, chained to a bunch of other people, unable to move. And again, stuck that way for weeks, just shitting on yourself. Right now, the people having to see this, the very act of what they're doing is going to desensitize them to it, and it's going to force them to start dehumanizing the people. Because who the hell wants to do that to other human beings? You hear so far? So this is where a lot of our racist discourses are going to have to come from. Okay, so again, most of the area coming into here, right? But some are going to come up here as well, which is where we're going to end up running into, slavery and what becomes the United States. So I want to move in and talk a little bit about the Virginia colony, right? And how this is going to build up here. Because even though a majority of slaves are going to end up in the Caribbean and Brazil, a significant chunk end up coming up to here, right? And being used in some of the early colonies. So let's take a step back here and create the Virginia colony, right? So there's a place for some of those slaves to go. This is founded here during that weird kind of period we talked about last time. Just before like the English Civil War or whatever. You got like the Stuart monarchs. So James was the King of Scotland who became the King of England. This town is named after him, right? And it's named after him because it's a royal charter. The Virginia Company is a royal charter. What they're doing is they are creating a joint stock company with a charter from the government that says that they have responsibility for this area. And it was a huge chunk of territory. Originally, the claim on Virginia was like, would stretch all the way across the US. It's like, they had no idea what was there. They just said, from here on the coast to wherever it ends. They had to later change that. But it was like, here's a chunk of land that you guys can work with and make money on. Right? So it's kind of like given to that company and they have no competition with other companies, right? And the purpose, again, of a joint stock company is to make money for the shareholders. That's their job, right? That's it. That's their whole responsibility. So they have to find the best way to do that. They start with Jamestown here, 1607, 104 colonists they convinced to come over there and start settling, right? So these are, poor people from England that they've managed to like recruit onto the ships and send over. Most of them are going to die. In the first year, there were only 38 left. That's a lot of people that died, right? So you're talking, almost 2/3 of the population dies off. This is because of the whole like seasoning that they talked about. Being there, you go through your first few years, you're going to get sick as hell every single year. And if you survive all of those sicknesses, you're going to be okay. But a lot of people just didn't.
Is that the area where a bunch of people back then went missing? Was when they were first bringing the people over, that they said, okay, settle here, but it was so swampy that when they took forever to come back.
Oh, yeah, so you're thinking of,
they were missing.
that initial colony off of North Carolina. It's very close. That's a little further south. This is just slightly north of that. So if you're following up the eastern seaboard, you got like South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. We're in Virginia, so along the Chesapeake Bay. But the climate is the same. It's like swampy, it's malarial, it's subtropical, right? It's hot as hell, it's humid. So it's not something that these Northwestern Europeans were accustomed to dealing with, right? So they just didn't have the right kind of immunities to deal with the subtropical diseases. So a lot of them just start dropping dead. But yeah, the people that settled there have some of the same problems, which is one of the reasons that they gave up. Because they could have like held out for a while, if it wasn't for all the diseases and everything else they were running into. They eventually had to abandon it and then turn to the native tribes and say like, hey, you guys know how to live here, can you help? Because we're dying. These guys don't have that luxury. Because the company, being a joint stock company, has the money to keep waves of ships coming, right? And keep resupplying them. So they die, bring more and more and more, right? By 1609, 350 people had been sent over, of which only 100 were still alive, right? So you're still looking at a pretty significant death rate, right? And that stays the case for quite a long time because people did have to acclimate to it. We, of course, do a whole lot better these days. We have like air conditioning and all kinds of cool stuff to survive, but it didn't really done. You guys have probably run into stories around this kind of stuff. You ever seen like this movie? You guys know this stuff's bullshit, right?
Yeah.
These are like cute little myths. This is not what happened at all. Right. The people who came over here, a lot of them didn't even want to work. in the same way. They didn't want to put in the kind of work you would need to as a kind of like, I don't know, pioneer settler or whatever here. So it's very, very difficult to convince them to put in a significant amount of labor in order to get things going. And you end up eventually provoking conflicts with the populations that live around you, largely because the settlers are trying to take more and more chunks of land. And if they start taking chunks of land, they put up fences, they start farming on it, and people are used to, like, you know, walking through that territory, right? And now they can't anymore. So eventually you end up with these antagonisms, the wars are breaking out, and that's going to speed it up even more. So by 1610, there's only 60 people left out of that 350. Because now not only disease do they have to deal with, but people are shooting them too, because they don't want them there. All right, this is sort of problematic. And the English eventually are going to take on a literally genocidal view toward a lot of the indigenous populations there and start thinking about whenever they could, they would just kill whoever was there, right? And if they couldn't afford it, if there was more of them than there were of the settlers or whatever, they would try to like maintain the peace until they had enough troops. They're never really thinking about the way that the French or the Spanish did. Can we like mix and merge with these people somehow? They're just like, no, they're in the way. We want their land. Get rid of them. Right. So that kind of antagonism is there from the beginning. This is what saves the Virginia colony. Because with that kind of death rate, you know, you're looking just a few years, like 5 years in, 60 people left out of 350, you're gonna have a hard time attracting more people to come and stay there, right? It's like, hey, you guys want to go to like a cool vacation destination? Like, no, 3/4 of you will die, but it'll be fun for the ones who survive. You want to go? You're probably not going to sign up, right? So they have to come up with something that can make you rich. And tobacco is the thing. You guys know why tobacco is valuable, right? What's good about tobacco as a product? If you're a company wanting to sell this, it's addictive, right? He's like, oh, this feels interesting. Okay, this feels interesting. And you're like, I need more of it. Right? And you're like, I need more of it. And then you sell more and more and more. And that's kind of a problem for people and their health and their own finances, but it's really, really good for the corporation selling it, right? So the fact that you can make so much money off of a product like this is going to both attract more people to the colony, right? And give them something that they can use to make the colony more than self-sufficient, right? It starts producing a major profit for the investors because they're shipping out so much frickin' tobacco. It turns out they run out of space. They start growing in the frickin' streets. They're growing it in part of their houses. You know, like any place that there's dirt and a little bit of sunlight, you're just planting more and more tobacco to try and get more and more of it out, right? But the more of it you do there, there's all this farming. That's labor intensive, isn't it? It's a lot of work. And you just want to make money and build houses and hang out with your family. You don't want to be spending like 12 hours in the field picking tobacco. So we can find some more people to do that. You guys can see where that's going to go, right? This I think is just hilarious. Like the original charter, this is how it would have added up. That's Virginia. Isn't that crazy? It's not what it ended up being, right? But the initial charter is based on the fact that they literally knew nothing about what was here yet, right? They just knew the coast, right? And it found that. So they said, cool, here and then wherever, wherever it ends, just keep going. So that's kind of funny. But it does attract people because the company stands to make a whole lot of money, especially since you've got a product like this that is so very profitable. So one of the ways to come up with to bring more people in, thinking, well, there's lots of land around here. The indigenous population doesn't seem huge. Why don't we start attracting more and more farmers here by offering them tons of land, right? And you start offering deals to other people who can recruit other people to go, which is what you end up with like the headright system. So you'll get 50 acres of land, which is a lot of territory. I mean, a house with a yard is like a fraction of an acre, right? An acre is quite large. 50 acres is a big chunk of land, and you get that for anybody who's paying to send more colonists over. So some people who can afford the cost of shipping settlers, they're going to become major landowners. So you see the development already of a class system. Some people are going to get huge chunks of land that they own because they can afford to ship people over. Well, the people shipping over, they don't have anything right there. So they're going to be stuck working on that land, right? So it's already created a distinct aristocratic system in the US based upon ownership of land. But it's working. The colonies are attracting thousands of settlers in. And they're attracting people from all different social classes, anybody that they can. Here's an ad actually looking for some educated young men to work as a tutor in the household, because, people that had a decent life back in Europe, they want to build a nice new house in the Americas too, and they want to bring all those amenities. They want to have like servants cooking for them and stuff. So you need like a tutor to teach your kids Greek and Latin or whatever, but you're still going to come over in the same way. But the way a lot of people come over initially is what we call indentured servitude. And there's a lot of really disingenuous rhetoric that talks about indentured servitude as similar to slavery, but it is similar to slavery only in the more traditional forms of slavery, not in the racialized Atlantic system, because the people taking indentures are not considered subhuman. They're just people working a job. It's like taking a job. You guys, you're agreeing to sell. You guys know that you sell your labor to somebody else, right? You're selling your time. You're essentially selling your. I honestly don't understand why people shame sex workers, because basically all work is prostitution, right? You're selling your body, right? And often taking injuries and everything else that goes with that. You get banged around in the warehouse or whatever. You're absolutely selling your health out to somebody else for money, right? Indentured servitude is similar to that kind of ideal. It's just that you're stuck in a contract. You work for the 7 years, whatever. Like you're stuck working for somebody, and then you're free. Cool so far? The racialized form of slavery that we're going to develop is very distinct from this, right? But it does still have there's a piece of paper, owning some kind of ownership, although this is temporary, right? So you're bringing over tons and tons of people here, but of course, a lot of them still die. And you see the problem here with bringing over a bunch of agricultural laborer from West Europe to work these farms is that they have the physiology of Northwest Europeans, which is to say they've never lived in the tropics. So they're going to suffer from a lot of those diseases. This is honestly one of the reasons that people start developing weird racial ideas about some people being suited to certain types of work. No, it's that your body adapts to climate over generations, right? If the palest of you moved to the tropics and stayed there, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren, they would get steadily darker. It's just a natural process, because the genes that control that are present in all of us, and the bodies are simply adapting to where you live, right? And these Northern Europeans had not done that. They were never from this kind of climate, so they're suffering a lot. Tons of people are dying here, so there's an appalling mortality rate. Thousands of people are dying, which is one of the reasons that slavery is going to start looking attractive, right? Okay, so one thing that will develop at this point here, that's worth keeping in mind is some traditions of self-governance of these European settlers living in this area here, thinking, the country that we're from is really far away. We need to have some way to organize ourselves locally, right? So House of Burgesses is Virginia's assembly. It's like a parliament, right? Like a little Congress or something. The problem with its structure really reflects a lot of the dynamics, both of the time period in which it's created, but also of the class system developing the colonies, because the rich people took most of the seats. The people who owned most of the land got most of the votes. So most people who came over don't have a voice in the House of Burgesses, but a small number of people do. And that's worth keeping in mind long-term here, if you're thinking about the progress toward the creation of the United States, is that the push to independence was a primarily elite affair. It's mostly the rich landowners who wanted it, business owners who wanted it. Ordinary people were just kind of like, what's going on, right? And not much actually changed for them from colonial British rule to American rule, right? It stayed essentially the same. The political structure changed, but the political structure for the early US was extremely elitist. All the way up until 1830, 5% of the population could vote. Right? It was just not anything close to what it is today. But the patterns for that are established pretty early on with a very elite structure to the colonial governments that come into here. So I'm just using the House of Burgesses as an example of that. There's all the different colonies had their own approach to this, but they're all fairly elitist and built around land ownership, which is why so many US states for a long time required that you own land in order to vote. All right, that tradition starts here. Cool so far? So there's that. Now, there's a fun way to get at the interesting class dimensions of this within the Virginia colony that will also touch on the question of slavery and how this is appearing here. Because as of around 1619, you have a Dutch ship show up and say, hi, I've got a bunch of these Africans on board and they can totally work for you and they're really good at working in the tropics. You want to buy them? Like, buy people? What are you talking about, right? But they do. And initially it's a little confusing. They, many times, after a few years, they would like set them free. So for a while, there was like a free Black population in Virginia. That will later change, right? But it's confusing initially, but people quickly learn that enslavement will make them a shit ton of money. So right now you've got a bunch of indentured servants working, and you have a bunch of slaves working, right? Because you've got decades of this process in both cases. Here we are, 1676, right? So you're 70 years into this process. There are thousands of indentured servants and thousands of African slaves, and they're all working side by side in the fields, right? They're both doing the work. They're both picking cotton together, right? And there are certain questions arising because the indentures and some of the slaves too, because people were manumitting slaves, all these people are like, well, how do we get land? Right? There's not enough land because these rich dudes, because of the headright system, they control all the land around Jamestown. So it's taken already, right? We want to go farther out. We want to move farther out and establish new settlements and take new chunks of land, because if you're free, that's what you kind of want. You want to control a piece of land, control your own life. Does that make sense so far? But they can't do it. The government of the Virginia colony, the Virginia Company, does not want the free Blacks or the free indentures to move farther out and take more land. Why do you think they're trying to keep them from going farther away? Why wouldn't you just say, like, go out and settle everything, take it all over? Like,
They want it.
what was that?
They want it.
Part of it is like a sense of like control, at least, politically, economically. If they go completely outside of it, then you kind of lose the ability to profit on it. So that is there. There's a bigger reason why they're nervous about people spreading out. So yeah, so there is a question of control that does come in here, right? You do want to be able to keep an eye on them. You want to be able to make a profit off of them. So that is a factor. There's a more immediate one.
It would become competition almost.
It could become competition, especially if they break that independence and start creating their own thing. But the problem here is that's why you have a monopoly company. All of the produce has to be shipped out to the Virginia Company. So legally, they're trying to avoid that competition already, right? But they don't want that. That's true.
Unknown territory, maybe.
It is new territory. It's unknown. Because it's unknown, could it be inhabited?
They don't know.
Yes, the Amerindian population, the Native American population. That's the worry. If you push out farther and move into somebody else's territory, if they finally establish like, okay, an uneasy peace, we live here, you live there, it's okay. If you move further out into their territory, they're going to fight back. And if they see you, they're going to assume it's the colony that's taken the land and the company, right? So they're going to attack Jamestown. So the company wants to protect its investment on the land that it already controls, and it does not have the resources to provoke a war with the tribes around it because they massively outnumber the colonists. Cool so far? So this is where Nathaniel Bacon's going to come in here. He sometimes likes to, bill himself, and some people have thought of him as like kind of like, I don't know, a precursor to the whole like, revolutionary ideal and independence, liberty, all that kind of crap. We really shouldn't think of him that way at all. In part because he's kind of a dick. I'll tell you why in a moment. But in part, also because the context is simply very, very different, right? The bigger issue you're dealing with here is a question of class, not of like an abstract concept of liberty. It's the freedom to be able to profit for yourself and not work for the company that they're looking for. But in the process of that, they're bringing, again, this essentially genocidal ethos toward the Native Americans. He wants to head out there and like he's like hanging out with this other tribe and they're talking about these guys and hey like this guy's like this other tribe is like, you don't like those guys, right? You want to go into their territory? Because like the governor's telling him he can't do it. He wants to do it anyway. So he's like, thinking about this. And the tribe goes out and they pick a fight and they defeat a tribe that had been antagonistic toward the colonists, right? And then they come back and they're partying and they're like, yeah, like we totally like kicked their asses for you. It's great. Let's all be friends. And they're hanging around past the pipe, cool. And then they go to sleep. And then Bacon and his men get up in the middle of the night and kill all of those warriors that had just done their dirty work for them. And then they go back to the colony and they brag, oh, we're just these awesome Indian fighters, cool. We killed a whole bunch of people in 2 different tribes. We So that should make it easy for us to go out and take more land, right? Well, the governor's still not having it because now he's like stepped way out of line and is provoking a war that could be problematic for the company, right? So he's like, no, you can't do this. And Bacon's like, dude, I'm in charge now. I got a gun, right? And that's that. So it's an uprising inside the colony. The thing that's I think most important about this, the thing that I hope will matter the most to you is when Bacon puts together his army and wants to oppose that power structure and spread out and take land. Yes, there's this awful genocidal aspect of it, because obviously they're going to wipe out the natives in order to take the land, but it doesn't have the structural racism yet, because his army is a mix of black and white people. There's a whole bunch of Africans in it, along with a whole bunch of European indentures, because they've been working side by side in the fields for decades, and they see a common class interest. They are both being screwed by the same elites. The company and the landowners are the ones holding all of them down, making sure that the former indentures can't get land of their own, so they have to stay dirt poor workers, and then enslaving people as they come aboard, right? Do you see what I'm getting at here? Poor people can often work together and recognize the commonality of interest there, unless you do something to divide them. And that's the purpose of the racist ideology, is to divide the workers against each other, so they're fighting, which makes it easier for the company to sit on top and keep making money off of both of them. Does that make sense? The workers at this point don't have an idea that African people are somehow physically inferior to them. They understand their common humanity and their common class interest, right? So the rebellion doesn't really work, but the company responds by ending indentured servitude and starting to develop an ideal where those Europeans are somehow, even if they're dirt poor, by their nature superior to the slaves that are coming over. So even though you don't own land and you're still working for somebody else, you're still like, you know, an abused working class person here, you can kind of like look down your nose, at least I'm not one of those slaves, right? And feel a little bit better about your situation. And by doing that, you develop that massive racial antagonism that builds up in the country. You here so far? This takes a long time to develop, a long, long time to develop. There's a significant amount of work that has to go into this. Tons of propaganda, tons of like articles and newspapers and, you know, books and whatnot, pamphlets being put out there, preachers out there talking about, you know, how God wants slavery and slavery is fine. There's a ton of stuff that's going into this, and there's laws being passed, and it takes decades and decades and decades and decades of this kind of stuff to really sink in culturally, and because people have to be raised in an environment where you believe that. Because if you're not, it's really hard to accept the concept that some people who are obviously human are actually not, right? But if you grow up in that kind of system, if you grow up in that kind of ideology, then it'll make a certain amount of sense. Goes so far? So replacing the indentured servants with more slaves. So now the slave trade is going to really take off in North America, and they're bringing tons more people here. And there's a ton of stuff that flows out of this all the way through the 19th and into the 20th century here, trying to reinforce the idea here of significant racial differences between people. So this is, you know, again, why we got the first ship there coming up, and then it just builds up and builds up and builds up. But as late as the 1660s. So again, this is during the time of Bacon's uprising, right? In the 1660s, 1670s, a third of the black population of Virginia were actually free, because people were letting their slaves go because they didn't understand the idea of holding people permanently in bondage, because they didn't think of them as not human. Right? So it didn't quite make sense yet. In the wake of Bacon's rebellion, they have to tackle this problem. They have to get people to start thinking of those slaves differently, or the black people differently, so they keep them enslaved. Now, there's some interesting questions here that you can see by looking through old court cases, you know, old discussions of the systems. And you can see some things that just wouldn't have worked out this way after a couple of centuries of this kind of racism. So here's a comment here. So in 1630, there was a white man whipped for defiling his body and laying with a Negro. So basically, he slept with a black person, right? So they whipped him for it. And you're like, oh yeah, that's because they're totally racist. Yeah, you know, like no one, you know, like, you know, interracial, whatever. Like, no, it's actually probably because it was gay sex, right? So they whipped him for having gay sex with an African, right? Not because he was sleeping with a black person, right? 1680, a white woman accused a black man of rape, right? But in the trial, the court sided with the black man. You with me here? That would not have happened in, say, I don't know, the 1860s or the or the 1950s. You know, it just wouldn't have worked. Over and over again, all somebody had to do was say, that guy looked at me, and you got a lynch mob riled up, right? The juries were always going to convict. This is not the case earlier on. They would actually look at the evidence and think about it because they're not keen to work within a framework where they're dehumanizing people. You here so far? So the situation looks very, very different early on. So I want to give you just a couple of examples of laws that have passed. So I know this is, oh my gosh, it's like, oh, 17th century English, it's so hard to read, torturing you. But let's think about this for a second, right? Doubts arisen that were children by an Englishman upon a Negro woman, so basically having sex with like a slave or something, so you're having, you know, mixed race kids, should be slave or free, right? So all children born in the country shall be held in bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, right? So basically, this is saying if you done raped your slaves, the children are slaves, period. That's it. As long as the mother's a slave, the child's a slave. Doesn't matter if they're part European or whatever, right? So you're passing a law that essentially gives free rein to people to do that. This is one of the reasons that if you look at the African-American population and not like recent immigrants, but people descended from slavery, they all have some European ancestry because so many slaves were raped and that gets passed along and mixed in there, right? Because it was just the norm. And here you are justifying it in the laws, right? And doing it in a way that, honestly, this suddenly becomes profitable because if she has kids and they're slaves, I didn't have to buy them, did I? Do you see the incentive here from the perspective of the slave owner? You're basically encouraging them to be horrible to people. Okay, so here's a fun one here. Baptism, the question of Christianity. A lot of people were arguing because most of the slaves who came over, they either had traditional African beliefs, something from like, you know, the Akan, you know, shamanic faiths there, or they were Muslim. You know, very few of them were Christian. So they get over there and they're bringing their own religions with them. But of course, the settlers are all Christians, right? Mostly Protestants, but you know, all Christians. And the argument was, well, what if they accept baptism? What if they become Christian? Can I keep a Christian slave? He's become a good Christian. He's my brother in Christ. I can't keep him a slave anymore. And they were setting their slaves free, right? So they would learn enough. They'd be able to like recite things out of the Gospels, whatever. They're like dedicated to it. And suddenly they're just, okay, you're free. So they passed a law saying, you can't do that anymore. That's it. You cannot set people free because they're Christian. They can be Christian as they want to be. They're still slaves, right? And here's a really fun one, like the last one I want to throw at you here, right? And again, oh, it's a giant wall of text in terrible English. I know you're all going to hate me for it, but try and read this and think about it because it's good for brain to try and like work through this kind of text somehow. Yeah, it does help you. The argument here is, say like, I have an expensive phone, right? And it breaks. So the argument here is, did I do it intentionally, right? Or not? Was it some kind of accident? Because I have to recognize the value of this, right? So am I likely to just like throw it at the floor and smash it? Probably not. So if it falls and breaks, I should be able to claim, well, no, it was an accident, fell off the table, you know, I didn't do it because why would I do something? Because it's expensive, right? I don't want to have to buy a new one. You with me here so far, right? You're thinking in terms of property, of chattel, something you own. So the argument here is, you own a slave and you are disciplining your slave. You know, so you're whipping somebody or beating them, right? And oh, they die in the process of that. The argument here in the law is you couldn't have intended to kill that person because killing him costs you money. You've now lost a slave. Why would you do that on purpose? Of course you were just trying to beat them to teach them a lesson. And then it just like, it accidentally went so far. Oh, that's just an accident. That's okay. That's okay. You can do that. Do you see the consequence of a law like this? Because once this is in place, and once the culture gets considerably more racist, you have now given people the freedom to murder at will. you can beat the holy hell out of people, and if they die, they die. So if you can afford it, you can afford it. And have you seen that film Django Unchained?
Yo, yeah.
It's one of my favorite Tarantino films. So it's really well done, right? You see like the brutality that you see on Candyland, right? Some of those plantations were absolutely like that because it just didn't matter. That it was so profitable for them that if occasionally like you let the dogs kill one of your slaves, it just happened, right? It's no big deal. And you now have cover legally. It's not murder because they're property. You see the consequences of this so far? This is what I'm talking about in terms of like building up that culture of racism. Over long periods of time, in the presence of social structures like this, people are going to lose, that sense of like, respect for the other person's humanity. Okay? Now, a neat point I want to make here too is about resistance. And this is a fun one here because you guys know there was a ton of like weird, what do you call it? You're basically like insulting Black people as somehow they're naturally lazy or stupid. Like there's all these like stereotypes. That's what I was looking for, right? There's terrible racial stereotypes that we would have, right? And people continue to cite things like this, which is just insane to me, right? But a lot of them have their origins in the period of slavery because slaves were intentionally resisting their enslavement. So someone's like, get out there and pick a bunch of cotton for me. What? What are you talking about? Like, I'm gonna act really, really dumb. Right? Okay, and I'm gonna go out there nice and slow and do some work. Do just the minimum necessary. If they hit me a little bit, I'll work a little bit harder. But I'll stop at the point where they're willing to accept my rate of work. Does that make sense? I'm not motivated. I don't get anything out of this. I'm a slave. Right? Why would I work hard? So intentional slowdowns were normal. Intentional defiance, right, was normal. Actual uprisings, like violent rebellions, they did happen. They weren't terribly common because there were a lot of white people with guns, right? So you were not likely to get away, but it did happen. And a lot of people ran away too. Some of them ran away and managed to form new communities further inland. So you had a ton of like communities that built up in parts of the Caribbean, further inland, up in the highlands, whatever, way away from the plantations, that developed their own distinct communities based on runaway slaves. That was a little harder to do in North America, but some people ran away and actually managed to join Native American tribes, right? Or get away and like form their own isolated communities in some random part of like a bayou or something that no one was going to. So people would run away and try to find some way to survive. But more often people resisted as best they could within the situation they were. And then people started reading into that, right? Now, religion is an interesting one because there's a way in which religion can be seen as a liberatory phenomenon, but also one to justify the atrocities. And early on, a lot of preachers were upset about it. This is what we saw with the Spanish and Portuguese. Remember the whole, you guys remember what the encomienda system was? Where the conquistador gets a chunk of land, he gets all the people on it, he can do whatever the hell he wants. And the first people to object were the Catholic priests. They're like, what the hell? What are you doing to these people? They're human, right? Aren't they human? I think they're human. They have souls. If they have souls, you can't do this, right? So religion can object. And early on, this is happening in North America too, right? A bunch of Protestant preachers were saying, we shouldn't be treating people this way. And then people started emphasizing certain parts of the Bible. Because again, if you got a generation that grows up with that system, it's a little bit more normal for them, and then they're going to look for ways to justify how they believe. And then they're going to find cute passages where St. Paul will say things like, slaves, be good to your masters, don't resist your masters, because you'll be free in the kingdom of heaven or something, right? And they're pulling out those lines and emphasizing them, right? So religion becomes an enabler. And it does so largely because the economy is dependent upon this labor. So if you want your job preaching anyway, you got to have a community making money. You're going to justify the way that they live somehow. You're going to find ways to rationalize it to yourself. And as soon as they do it, and they're going to pass their ideas on to other people. Cool so far? So the Bible was turned into ways to say, be a happy slave, right? And that just continues and continues and continues. So here's like there's two pieces from the New Testament where you can do this. And a lot of times people would turn to preachers and have them actually putting effort into converting the slaves and making them good Christians, because if they're good Christians, then you can throw these lines at them and say, like, Jesus wants you to be good to your masters, right? And this is how you can become free in the kingdom of heaven. All right. So of course you develop all the spiritual traditions and the songs and like trying to find some way, and then the symbolism of like the exodus out of Egypt, with Moses and whatnot, and how people can connect that to their situations. There's a lot of ways in which the religion then takes on a liberatory aspect for the slaves, but is used by the masters to hold people down. Right. And it kind of works. So there's that. So you've got a weird connection here between race and religion, where the two support each other actively. And you end up with a lot of like really weird shit, like this whole Hamitic idea. They try to go back to, there's like, you guys know like Noah and the flood or whatever. It's like one of the myths in Genesis. Noah has sons, right? But one of them sees him naked, and that's somehow a big problem. So he was cursed by God. And that becomes the ancestors of African people and Jews. Right? It's sort of like trying to argue here, like, the Canaanite nations, like, people's in the same area, right? But it's basically arguing that these people are cursed by God for destruction. The Canaanites, were originally the same population. This is going way back in like the early Iron Age, right? Canaanites and Hebrews like just differentiate each other religiously, but they're originally the same people, right? But the one hates the other and talks about trying to destroy it. So putting them here is intentional. It's saying that God doesn't mind if you destroy these people. You see what I'm getting at here? And of course, they look nothing like them. The Canaanites look, they look like me, right? But if you put all the African peoples into the same Hamitic line, you're essentially saying they are indefinitely cursed by God, and you can treat them like shit. There's nothing in the Bible that actually supports this. Some dude just made this shit up. Right, just said, oh yeah, he has 3 sons. So like, there's 3 different types of people. Let's like break it all up that way, right? So there's that, and then it gets much worse. So just for fun, I'm going to give you just like a couple second preview, and then I'm going to play the little video clip, right? So just, you guys know scientific racism becomes a thing starting in the 18th century. They start studying skulls and whatnot, and all across the 19th century, they start thinking about a multiple genesis idea, and they're actually distinct species. They're not truly human, right? So there's multiple beginnings to life, right? And you start thinking in terms of like weird hierarchies too, right? Some animals are above others. So Europeans are way up here, and then, you can start fitting other things in different places. So all this weird like chronology type stuff, measuring skulls and whatnot, you guys know it's ultimately bullshit, right? Like the shape of your skull doesn't affect like whether you can have a brain in there. Like Neanderthals had like a much longer skull, with a very, very low forehead. Their skulls are very, very different shape, but technically their brains are bigger than yours. So all those things about like dumb cavemen, like using Neanderthals, doesn't make any sense at all. Neanderthals were no less intelligent than you. Their brains were literally larger, right? So they were just as smart as we were. But people are like looking at skull shapes and connecting them to animals, right? Well, to other apes, right? Because technically we're kind of ape, but whatever. That's a whole different conversation, and not really something I want to get into like a modern world class. But there's orangutans, gorillas here, and oh my goodness, look at this! And people from like Papua New Guinea, people from the far southern tip of Africa, right? So yeah, this is pretty intentionally bad, right? And again, long-term legacy of this. So trigger warning, 2 terrible things I found on the internet, right? This is pretty far back. This is when Obama was running for president back in 2008. And someone decided to take every possible horrific stereotype they would and throw it on there, which is pretty fucked up, right? Or like, I don't know, from peeling bananas to busting caps, right? This is terrible shit. But people still believe this stuff because once a system exists, once it is there, and it develops again for economic reasons, but once it's there and it depends upon the dehumanizing of people, then it's really hard to peel those ideas back and get rid of them, right? It takes a lot of self-examination. So when people are criticizing these systems today, we're not talking about when there were slaves. We're talking about the legacy of it today, what's left of it today, examining our behavior today and how does it reinforce this bullshit. That make sense? I mean, that's the stuff that I think we really need to grapple with. And I think a lot of people are really keen not to have that conversation, to push it away in any way they can, because it's very difficult to look at yourself and think, have I done things or whatever, am I contributing to this system? Those are hard conversations to have with yourself. So that's where I'm going to leave off here. I'm going to throw a little clip up here and have Tim yell at you for a little while instead. So that'll be fun.
Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and Lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock cleaned. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the west. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly. But back then they had no shame, so they didn't try and cover it up. They openly said it, but once again, the rich didn't want to go do the work. Are you kidding? No. They're going to get poor people to go fight for them. And the poor folks didn't even own slaves. Now think, how do you get poor people who don't even own the shirt on their back, let alone slaves, to go fight to keep your slaves for you? You've got to convince them that their skin is more important than their economic interest. Because think about it, if I am a farmer who has to charge you $1 a day or $2 a week to work on your farm and harvest that tobacco or pick that cotton, but you can get a black person to do it for free because you own them, who's going to get the job? Not me. In other words, slavery actually undermined the wages and the wage base, the economic floor of the typical white working class or low-income person. But they were told, if these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. And so at some level, again, working class white people being harmed by white privilege, relatively being advantaged, right? Being given a leg up, being given a membership to the club, but in absolute terms being kept economically subordinated by the very thing that gave them a sense of superiority. How's that for irony? Then in the present era, this hasn't stopped. This is not ancient history. Now we have people running around insisting that we should close the border with Mexico because if we don't, the wages of working class people will continue to fall. The implication being that the only reason workers are paid like crap in this country is because the border is open. But if you believe that, you would actually have to believe that if that border were closed, that all these owners of capital and industry would just say, oh, well, you figured us out. Here, it's a raise. Do we really believe that the only thing keeping bosses from paying people more is the presence of low-wage, medium, semi-skilled labor from south of this artificial border? Is that really what we believe? We know that if that border is closed, it isn't going to be closed to capital. It isn't going to be closed to goods. If you have a border that can be crossed by capital looking for the highest return on investment or goods looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin, how is that going to work to the benefit of working people? By definition, it doesn't. By definition, it immiserates the working class. Divide and conquer. But the best example of all, perhaps, in the contemporary era, in the greater New Orleans area after Katrina. Here you have two communities that were the most hard hit. The lower Ninth Ward, mostly black community, 94% African American, about 40% official poverty rate, heavy working class community. And right across the canal, St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, 95% white, also working class, high levels of poverty, economically very similar. And at the end of the day, in those first few days of September 2005, more similar than they probably would have realized. Because when those levees broke, they all got their stuff jacked. They all got their stuff destroyed. But if you had asked white folks in Chalmette, and I've done it, who was the cause of the problems in the greater New Orleans area prior to that flooding, they would have pointed across that canal at those black folks, wouldn't have called them black folks, and would have said, there, that's the problem. 70% of the white folks in St. Bernard Parish voted for David Duke, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States when he ran for governor in 1991. 7 out of 10 gladly voted for him because he was blaming black folks for all of their problems, and they bought it. What's the irony? The irony is that while they were blaming black people for their problems, while they were blaming black people for the conditions of the greater New Orleans area in which they lived, nobody was paying attention, least of all they, to the fact that these white elite politicians, either in Baton Rouge or in Washington, whose job it was to secure those levees, to make sure that levy funds were spent in the proper way and that they were spent at all, those mostly white and mostly elite politicians did nothing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just the black folks in the lower Ninth Ward they didn't care about. They really couldn't have given a rat's ass about those poor and working class white folks either. And yet, when the people of Chalmette, people of St. Bernard Parish got back into session, first time they had a city council meeting, parish council meeting after the flooding, the lights aren't even on yet. The water isn't even hooked up. And the first order of business was to pass an ordinance saying that you couldn't rent property in St. Bernard Parish to anyone who wasn't a blood relative. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination as to why you want to pass a law. That law had never existed before. But now that it's been emptied out and you don't know who might come back, that's a damn good way to keep black people out, isn't it? Because if you're 95% white to begin with, if you pass an ordinance that says that, that's a great, you can't say no blacks need apply. You can't say no blacks allowed, but that was an ingenious way to get around the law. Now, they got caught. There was a lawsuit threatening, they got rid of the ordinance. But my point in bringing it up is to say, once again, divide and conquer is working. These white folks in Chalmette need to march across that canal and join hands with the black folks who've been sitting there more than willing to work with them for an awful long time and march on Baton Rouge and march on DC and march on the Corps of Engineers and recognize their commonality of interest. But the whiteness and the lure of whiteness has tricked these have nothing in their bank account white people into believing that they got more in common with the rich white folks on St. Charles Avenue that didn't lose anything in that flooding than they have in common with the black working class folks who live about 500 yards away.
Okay, so you see why I thought this is valuable, right? Because the question here really is around the whole concept of race. It has no biological element to it. The geneticists have been telling us this for ages. You know, white Europeans, you know, are genetically more like West Africans and East Africans than West and East Africans are like each other. Right? But to those same racist people, the Africans all look the same, right? it's nothing in our DNA. There's nothing biological about racism. It's just a concept that we throw around and we use to manipulate people, divide and rule, right? And this continues. This is the problem. This is not that it's just in the pre-Civil War era. You know, you guys know there's a ton of like those Confederate monuments all over the South. They've been like, you know, getting in the news every now and then. In the last few years, people are like arguing about them, trying to tear them down. Most of them were built in the 1880s and 1890s during the progressive and populist era, when there was a lot of attempts to bring together poor white and black working class people to get a better life for themselves. And they needed to break those coalitions. They needed to break people apart. So hence a massive effort to spread more of that racism, right? Does it make sense here? You got to keep this stuff up constantly in order to maintain it, right? If we can attack the basic structures of this, if we can remove it from the legal systems, if we can remove it from our educational institutions, eventually the shit can fade away. But as long as we're not willing to have those conversations and address the real problems, it's never going to, right? And we'll be stuck with a legacy that goes back into the slave era. So it's the contemporary world that's the problem. That's the thought I want to leave you guys with. Cool, cool, cool.
Yeah.
Any thoughts? All good? Have a lovely day.